Mr. President, I just want to speak for a moment about a potential CRA, another CRA that's perhaps coming to the floor this week or next week. And that is one that would take away the ability of states to try to do something about the retirement crisis that is enveloping this country. I speak as one of the youngest members of this chamber, and it scares me to death to think that half of Americans have no money saved for retirement today who are in the working years before qualification for Social Security or Medicare. Even worse, a study that I looked at the other day suggested that 58% of Americans who are working haven't even done the calculation as to how much money they need in order to retire. There's a retirement crisis in this country, and you can understand why. Wages have been essentially flat for tens of millions of Americans, and employers have largely left the space of defined benefit plans. And there's just not money to save when you just have to cobble together your paycheck to meet your budget every week, and your employer isn't putting in the kind of plans that they used to, the kind of contributions that they used to. So you can understand why Americans are in this position. And so state governments, those laboratories of experiments that I hear a lot of my Republican friends talk about, have come up with an idea. There are 55 million working Americans who don't have a way to save for retirement out of their regular paycheck, meaning their employer is not offering them any way to set aside a portion of their income in order to save. So there's one number, 55 million Americans. Here's another. In my state, 44% of workers in my state don't have access to a retirement plan through their employer. That's about 600,000 people in Connecticut. Half my state doesn't have access when they show up to work to a retirement savings plan through their employer. And yet we know that employees who have access to a payroll deduction are 15 times more likely to save for retirement, right? Not twice as likely, not 5 times as likely, 15 times more likely. So, it just stands to reason that state legislatures would step in and say, okay, for employers that aren't offering a plan, we're going to give employees the ability to set aside a small portion of their earnings into a privately run plan that is sponsored through the state government. If the employer is not going to do it, then there's really no one else other than the state government. And so the states have decided in a handful of occasions to step in and offer this option to employees. And by the way, it is, as far as I understand, not traditionally a state-run plan. It's a privately run plan. It's just that the state is acting as the conduit to get employees linked with private plans and to allow for a small portion of their paycheck to be set aside. 15 times more likely employees are to save if they have access to that payroll deduction. This is, a pretty run-of-the-mill, typical state intervention to try to solve a problem that is real for state legislators. And so it's just a mystery to me as to why we would try to take that ability away from states. What we're doing is we're taking away an ERISA exemption for states relative to these plans. And why that's important is, ERISA is all about the employer-employee relationship. And so there are important responsibilities that flow from employers to employees when they are engaging in a retirement plan that's offered through the workplace. But the state is not the employer of this individual. The state is simply acting as a conduit to get that employee into a private sector plan. And so the ERISA rules just simply don't work. They're a mismatch for this state innovation. And so the federal government, through regulation, recognized that. Importantly, in my state of Connecticut, which does have one of these plans, we provide ERISA-like protections. So the protections you get in ERISA, you get through this state innovation. It's just that the way in which the federal government normally requires it doesn't make sense because, again, the state in this case is just the conduit, not the employer. This sort of seemed like a pretty run-of-the-mill exercise of state innovative power, a fairly run-of-the-mill exercise of federal regulatory authority to allow for this innovation to happen. And it's hard to understand why we're taking it away, why we're taking this ability away from 600,000 Connecticut residents who, frankly, won't have access to easy retirement savings without it. We've known that set-asides in your paycheck work. That's why we've provided incentives for employers to do it, but not every employer does it. Why? Because if you're a small employer, it just may not make sense administratively to establish one of these plans, and so states have decided to offer it themselves. Now, I know that the retirement industry may not love this idea because they might not make the same fees on these plans as they would if it was offered through the employer. But, frankly, these hundreds of thousands of people in my state, they're not going to be the retirement company's customers without this innovation. So it's not like, these state-backed plans are stealing business from the private retirement plans. They were never going to be customers without the ability, to put aside a little bit of money. We have a retirement crisis in this country right now, and this is an innovative way to solve it. So I know this is not yet scheduled for a vote, this Congressional Review Act vote that would take away the ability of states to offer these plans in a meaningful way. And I really hope that we would think twice about it. It sort of feels like we're just inventing CRAs to bring before the Senate and the House now. We're kind of, scraping the bottom of the barrel, and this one just doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. Let states that want to pass this innovation, that want to give their constituents, their citizens, the ability to save through payroll deductions, through payroll withholding, the ability to do that. Don't do the bidding of the big retirement providers who may think that they're going to make more money if the CRA passes, but in reality, these folks were probably never their customers. Let states move forward with this innovation. Let people of Connecticut and California see how it works so that maybe other states can learn from our experience. I hope that we can come to some agreement to leave this innovation alone, to move on to some other important issue here, and not risk doing something that is frankly going to exacerbate the retirement crisis that exists in this country. Republicans and Democrats should be trying to work together on this question of giving people more access to retirement plans. This is for all the things that we fight over, whether it be the health care law or whether it ultimately be a tax cut bill or a budget. This just seems like one of these issues where we should set this CRA aside with respect to the state innovations and try to find a way to find some common ground. And I hope that's where we'll head. It would really matter to my constituents in Connecticut who are expecting to receive the benefit of this access, this newfound access to retirement. I yield the floor.